Every kind of church needs to wrestle with this question. Hi, I'm Darren Ride from 12 Church, where we are seeking to figure out how to be and make disciples in this time and place. And part of that is figuring out how to include children and youth in that disciple-making journey. This video is intended as a discussion starter specifically for 12 Church and ultimately for any other micro churches or groups that are trying to face this challenge of figuring out how to make disciples of children, how to include children in alternative models of churches. The question, what about the kids, is often raised with reference to alternative model churches like house churches or 12 Church or disciple-making movements, with almost an accusing tone implying that there's really no way to do ministry, to do church, that works for kids and youth the same way a legacy church works. Oh, you're in a house church. But what about the kids? The truth is, the legacy church, church as we know it, isn't doing very well with kids for the most part. Kids are dumped into Sunday school, maybe midweek programs, maybe Bible camp, and some good things happen. They get into youth group, work their way through junior high, senior high, and as the age increases, the number of kids drops off until by the time they graduate from high school, it is goodbye. Sometimes, many times, goodbye forever to the church, and sometimes to the faith. That's often the flow of children and youth from Christian homes through the legacy church today. So if you are in a legacy church, let me ask the same question. What about the kids? What about your kids? Because what most churches are doing isn't working very well right now. When we ask the question about children and youth in relation to church or a model of church, we're often thinking programmatically, as in, well, we need a Sunday school program, some kind of kids program, a youth program, maybe a youth pastor of some kind, if we're going to reach and disciple and hang on to our kids. And if we don't have all these things, how in fact could we ever reach them, disciple them, keep them? But that's the wrong framework on multiple points. Programming is not the make or break issue. Do you want to know what the make or break issue is? It's the parents. Are the parents passionate followers of Jesus Christ? Is the life of Christ at work in them and through them? Do they have current stories of God at work? Do they include their children in those stories? Do the children have experiences or at least observations of God at work as the family is on mission together? Do they have examples of lives being transformed by the gospel, of prayers being prayed and answered in supernatural ways? Are they seeing and experiencing the transforming work of the gospel? See, in Christian homes, the issue with kids and their faith is actually about the parents. And I don't say this as a guilt dump, but rather as a reality check. So when we ask the question, what about the kids? We shouldn't really be asking, what about the programs? We should be asking, what about the parents? Because in most legacy churches, the parents are not disciples who are making disciples. And I believe that if we train parents to be disciples who make disciples, and those same disciple-making principles and lifestyle and passion showed up in the home and was applied in the family life, a lot of these issues would be addressed. And in fact, if we don't do that, even the best children's program, youth pastor cannot fill the gap left by Christian parents who are not passionate followers, disciple makers on mission with Jesus. Regardless of the nature of a given church, whether it's a legacy church or an alternative church or 12 Church, the primary disciple-making resource or program in a kid's life is their parents. What happens in the church, again, any kind of church, is supposed to be supplemental to what happens at home. But too often, kids are just dumped into Sunday school and dumped into youth group, and the church is trusted to kind of make it work and help the kids stick with the church. But it is about the parents. The question of what kind of church or what specific church to go to, what is best for our children at this time, is an important parenting question. It's a valid question. And that's why people will freely change churches based on a children's program, based on whether or not the kids like going to that church, whether or not they're making connections, making friends. It's totally understandable. But again, too often the parents forget that they are the primary spiritual influence in their children's lives. They lay the foundation and set the example of what it means to follow Jesus or not. So the first point I want us to hear today is that the solution of the drift of Christian kids through and then out of the church is not about better programming, but about more strategic parenting founded on disciple-making principles. Secondly, and this naturally flows from that first point, another part of the solution to kids from Christian families drifting or walking or running away from the faith is about asking the right question. And the question is, not do we have programs for our children or what kind of programs do we have, but are we actually making disciples? Are we making disciples? Are we making disciples of our children? Do we know how to make disciples? Are we ourselves disciples, passionate followers of Jesus? Which gets right to the heart of the issue. Is a specific church making disciples of the parents of those children? See, as soon as you ask the question, what about the kids? About 12 church or disciple-making movement or a house church or an alternative kind of church, as soon as you ask that question, you turn over a rock that leads to a whole series of questions, not just about the alternative church, but also about the legacy church. And you quickly realize, as you dig, that when it comes to this question, the legacy church doesn't generally have a lot to offer, and in some cases is completely bankrupt when it comes to the issue of making disciples. So what about the kids? Yeah, what about the kids? Are you a disciple who's making disciples? Are you being equipped to be a disciple who makes disciples? Most likely, if you're part of a legacy church, it's not happening. Let's at least be honest about that. And adding a, quote, good kids program or youth program in the context of a church that isn't making disciples isn't going to solve the problem. It's certainly not going to make disciples of those children very effectively. I don't want to pretend that alternative models of church, like 12 church, are a guaranteed solution to this. But alternative models of church, like 12 church, can be a part of the solution if they are focusing on disciple making, because that focus and the principles will affect anyone within the orbit of that micro church, the adults, the youth, and the children. Let's talk about some specifics of how this can happen. The reason for this video is that we've been thinking about how children and youth fit into or should fit into 12 church. This is a question that every alternative kind of church needs to think through. And I believe that each microchurch or each cluster of microchurches needs to think and pray this through for their specific context, because one size will not fit all. And whatever solution we come up with in this time and this place will have to shift over time as different people cycle in and out and multiply out through those microchurches, through that disciple-making movement. Some of the examples I'm about to mention might not work in your specific context, others might, or some of these ideas might trigger an idea that will be just perfect for the situation that you're in. One of the big issues in understanding whether 12 church or any other microchurch weekly meeting is to understand that we're not in any way trying to replicate on a smaller level what happens in the Sunday morning service in a larger church. We're not just taking that and shrinking it down to a smaller size. We're really, at this stage of 12 church, not doing anything with reference to the Sunday morning service. Perhaps if we have multiple groups in an area from time to time, every month or every quarter, we get together for what looks like a worship service. But right now, we're not trying to clone that. We're working from a blank slate, apart from the Bible, and trying to create a simple, sustainable structure that makes disciples right here and right now. And just as we wouldn't expect the Sunday morning service in a legacy church to accomplish everything that a church is supposed to be and do, we should not expect one weekly gathering in 12 church or some disciple-making movement to accomplish everything the church is to be and do biblically. It can't happen. Let me say that again. Neither 12 church nor any micro church is just about one weekly gathering. If you're in a group that has a lot of seekers, it's going to look different than if you're in a group with a lot of long-term churched people. If you have an older group versus younger group, a group with a lot of kids, a rural scattered group, or a group that is all in one apartment complex, it's going to look different in each case. If you're in a cluster of microchurches where there's a lot of microchurches in your area, which I think is a worthy goal, certainly a goal of 12 church, it's going to look different than if you're just one little microchurch out in the boonies somewhere. Now let me float some specific ideas by you that I've learned in this last while. Number one, you could have your primary meeting, your primary weekly event, primarily about the kids. It could be all about the kids. And that is your primary ministry, your primary thing you do. And maybe you have another secondary meeting where you focus on some adult issues, but the locus of ministry for your group is about kids. Of course, that creates some challenges when it comes to discipling adults and certainly reaching seekers, but that is one way of organizing a group. You could have it so that kids up to a certain age just kind of hive off from the main meeting and they're either taught somewhere else or they're played or they're babysat or cared for in some way, and you focus in the group on adult stuff. And maybe group members rotate in caring for the kids and teach the kids, or even hire someone from the outside to take care of those kids. But you make the group primarily about the adults up to a certain age. When kids are a certain age, they jump in. You could have for children a completely separate time in the month, once or twice or more per month, where it really is all about the kids, but your primary gathering is adult disciple making and maybe working with seekers, adult seekers as well. And in that primary meeting, there are no children's components, so there may be children present, but there's no active children components. That's for another time in the month. I heard of one group that was made up primarily of young families with young kids. And just the age and stage of these families, it was impossible for them to have multiple meetings per week. So they had one meeting per week and they alternated. One week was all about the adults and the kids were maybe, babysat or something. The next week was all about the kids, focusing on the kids. And the idea was that everybody still showed up to both meetings, at least the adults did, with a focus on adults one week and for the children on the next week. Neighborhood style groups, where people live in close proximity, maybe even borderline communally, where there's a lot of visiting back and forth, a lot of shared meals. It can be a little less formal, a little less structured for the most part, because there's interactions and gatherings of different sizes all the time. They might have a get together with just the parents doing their things. The kids are out playing. They might put on some event for the kids. They might put on a big barbecue, invite some seeker friends. And there's just this neighborhood ebb and flow to it that would be completely different than a scattered group. And while there would be these formal moments of Bible study and training, a lot of it would happen informally, both with the children and the youth and the adults. In that kind of setting, there would be multiple weekly, in fact, probably multiple daily interactions under the umbrella of Christian life and mission. It would be truly doing life together and really maybe a lot closer to the way Jesus made disciples. I think an important principle, regardless of how you decide to include and ultimately win, build, and equip children and youth, is that families are learning to live on mission together, and groups of families and groups of friends are learning to live and work on mission together. Yeah, when it comes to evangelism, it's peer-to-peer typically. Dads reach dads and mums reach mums and youth reach youth and children reach children, but families can also reach families and work together to reach other families. And the children can be included in this mission very actively and very consciously. And we don't need to wait till the children enter their teen years or late teen years to include them in mission and explain what we're doing. They should be included early so they can see it and experience it and understand it, and it becomes a part of their life. 12 Church and other micro churches can, they don't necessarily do, but they can provide a much more integrated way of disciple making than legacy churches often do, where they silo people based on gender and age and keep them separate, teaching them separate things. We can do things differently. Now, this doesn't mean that every age group is always together with every other age group, or that men are never just with the men, or women are just with the women, or kids just with kids, and youth just with youth. But it means no matter how we structure it, we're always holding on to the principle of families engaging on mission together, and we as a group engaging on mission together, helping each other reach our friends, helping each other be passionate followers of Jesus. One more thing. Regardless of the type of church you're in, Legacy Church, 12 Church, some other micro-church disciple-making movement, you don't need permission as a parent to do things for your kids, or with yourself and some other friends for you and their kids, or for their youth. You don't need to be an official program. You don't need some pastor to sprinkle holy water on it. You don't need some, formal ministry plan. You simply need to see a need, pray it through, and follow the promptings of the Spirit, living out the mission on the direction of Jesus. I think a real danger and a limiting factor of the legacy church is that programs can become straitjackets, that we're forced to keep going and keep feeding even if they're no longer working. And it can be very difficult to try to adapt and shift if something else comes across our path and just try stopping a program that has outlived its usefulness. A possible strength in an alternative model of a church is that we can start and adapt and stop different, quote, programs or ministry ideas as needed. And we don't have the need to keep any specific program going forever and ever and ever, but we can stop it when it makes sense to reallocate resources somewhere else. And if we feel an idea has kind of lived out its usefulness, we pause and we pray and we regroup and follow Jesus into the next phase of the adventure. So again, let's ask the question, what about the kids? It's a good question, but the answer might not be what most people think it is. When you honestly ask the question, what about the kids? What about the youth? You go down a pathway that gradually exposes the ineffectiveness of the legacy church in actually making disciples of children and youth, and really of adults and families. And the answer to the question, what about the kids, is in part, what about the parents? What about making disciples who make disciples? What about having parents and other Christian adults modeling and teaching what it means to live out their lives on mission with Jesus? What about asking the Spirit for His heart and His strategy for making disciples of the people He's brought across our paths, including our children and our grandchildren? I'm guessing He's got some most excellent ideas.